The capitalist process of production. The labor process never exists in a pure form as such, but always with a socially determined form as a production process based upon slave labor, as a production process of feudal serfs, as a production process of independent artisans, or as a production process of wage laborers in capitalism. The product is a use value, only produced in capitalism if it embodies value and surplus value. Valorization is only possible because a particular labor power commodity is purchased and consumed for which the means of production such as raw materials and machines are necessary. A new mass of commodities is created with a value greater than that of capital advanced. The value of the means of production consumed in the creation of a commodity constitutes part of the value of the newly produced commodity. If a particular machine has a lifespan of 10 years, then 1/10 of its value is transferred to the mass of commodities produced within a year. Marx calls this constant capital, or C for short. On the other side, the value of labor power is not all transferred to the commodities produced, but the value newly generated by the consumption of labor power, by labor expenditure, is what is transferred to the value of newly created commodities. How much value the worker adds to the product of labor does not depend upon the value of labor power but upon the extent to which labor expended counts as value creating, abstract labor. The difference between the newly added value and the value of labor power is the surplus value, or S. The newly added value is equal to the sum of labor power and surplus value. Marx calls the portion of capital used to pay wages variable capital, or V for short. This portion of capital changes value during the production process. Workers are paid with variable capital but produce new value in the amount of V plus S. The value of a mass of commodities produced within a specific period of time can therefore be expressed as C plus V plus S, or constant capital consumed plus variable capital plus surplus value. The valorization of capital results solely from its variable component, measured by relating the surplus value to the variable capital, or S through V, the rate of surplus value. It is also a measure of exploitation of the labor power, usually expressed in percentage. The value of a mass of commodities produced within a specific period of time can therefore be expressed as C plus V plus S, or constant capital consumed plus variable capital plus surplus value. The valorization of capital results solely from its variable component, measured by relating the surplus value to the variable capital, or S through V, the rate of surplus value. It is also a measure of exploitation of the labor power, usually expressed in percentage. For the practical consciousness of the capitalists, the analytical category of surplus value is irrelevant. Capitalists calculate that an advance of capital in the amount of constant plus variable capital is necessary in order to realize a profit in the amount of surplus value, regarded as the fruit of capital. The capitalist measure of valorization is the ratio of profit, calculated as surplus value divided by constant plus variable capital. The length of the workday is given by the sum of necessary labor time in which the value of labor power is produced and surplus labor time in which the surplus value is produced. If the value of labor power within a particular society at a specific point in time is given, then the amount of necessary labor time, in which those products are produced, that are necessary for the reproduction of the exploited class, is also given, but not yet the amount of surplus labor time, in which the surplus product, that is the portion of the total social product appropriated by the ruling class, is produced. According to Marx, in any economic formation of society where the use value rather than exchange value of the product predominates, surplus labor will be restricted by a more or less confined set of needs, and that no boundless thirst for surplus labor will arise from the character of production itself. This thirst for surplus labor implies, since it knows no limits, that capital takes no account of the health and length of life of the worker and therefore also implicitly accepts the destruction of labor power. If the capitalist has purchased labor power at its daily value, then the capitalist has the right to apply labor power over the course of a day. It has to be shorter than 24 hours so that time remains for the physical and psychic regeneration of the workers, but how much shorter is not clearly determined. If the capitalist attempts to lengthen the workday, then he is merely attempting, like all other commodity buyers, to make the most of the use value of the commodity. The competition among capitalists compels them to make ample use of their buyers' rights of maximum utilization. Workers also behave according to the logic of buying and selling when they attempt to shorten the length of the workday. In order to sell their labor power anew, they have to dispose of it in its regular condition. In this, both capitalists and workers can invoke the laws of commodity exchange. A limit of the workday cannot be derived from these laws, which means that there is an antinomy of right against right, both equally bearing the seal of laws of exchange. Between equal rights, force decides. Hence, in the history of capitalist production, the establishment of the norm for the working day presents itself as struggle between collective capital and collective labor. The self-valorizing value, which is capital, has no intrinsic limits to valorization. At a given value of labor power, surplus value rate will increase if surplus value quantity increases by a lengthening of the surplus labor time, which is accomplished by lengthening of the workday. Marx refers to this as the production of absolute surplus value. Lengthening of the workday does not just occur when the number of daily working hours is increased, but also when those hours are used more efficiently through the shortening of break times or by no longer counting certain job preparations as working time. Furthermore, an increase in the level of intensity of labor has the same effect as lengthening of the work time, yielding a larger value product. But surplus labor time can also be increased without changing the length of the workday or by more efficient use of labor time, when the necessary labor time is reduced, that is, when the value of labor power decreases. If less hours now suffice for the production of the value of labor power, then more hours of surplus labor time remain. Marx refers to this decrease of necessary labor time as the production of relative surplus value. If the value of labor power is to be fully compensated, then a reduction in necessary labor time is only possible when either the quality and quantity of the means of subsistence considered necessary is reduced, or if the value of these means of subsistence decreases. When either the productivity of labor increases in those branches that produce means of subsistence, or when the productivity increases in those branches that deliver raw materials or machines. With cheaper means of production, the value of the means of subsistence also sinks. The idea that capitalists have an interest in the prolongation of labor time is intuitively plausible. The case is different with the increase in the productivity of labor. The extent to which individually expended labor time counts as value-creating labor depends upon whether the socially necessary labor time was expended or not. If a particular producer is able to produce a table in less than the socially necessary labor time, he can, for example, sell a product of 8 hours of labor as if it was a product of 10 hours of labor. This is exactly the case if a capitalist is the first to increase the productivity of labor within a particular process of production. In addition of the socially conventional surplus value, our capitalist realizes an extra surplus value or extra profit, which is the capitalist's main motivation for increasing the productivity of labor. This extra surplus value remains for the capitalist as long as the new method of production has not yet become generalized. The capitalist who was the first to introduce the productivity increase can either continue to produce the same amount as before but with fewer workers, or produce a larger amount of products with the same amount of labor time and workers. The first possibility is usually not realistic, since the increase in the productivity of labor is often only possible when the volume of production increases at the same time. The simplest way of selling the larger amount of products consists in sinking prices below the previous value. Our individual capitalist still does not have to completely forego the extra surplus value. The increased turnover for our capitalist means that other capitalists who offer the same product will sell less and in extreme cases go bankrupt. To defend their market share, they also have to sell at lower price. If their production method remains the same, this leads to a reduction in their surplus value. The other capitalists therefore have no choice than to raise the productivity of labor and reduce costs to keep up in the price competition. The intrinsic laws of capital, such as the tendency toward lengthening the workday and the development of productivity, are independent of the volition of individual capitalists. These laws impose themselves as iron laws of competition. Since each individual capitalist is familiar with this pressure, he does not wait until it is imposed on him by his competitors, but attempts to be the first to increase productivity. As the result, every capitalist puts the screws on all other capitalists, just as he himself is subject of the same pressure. Capitalist production begins when a large number of workers, brought together under the command of a capitalist, work together for the production of the same type of the commodity. The cooperation of many workers brings about, even without change to a technical conditions of production, a reduction in value of products. Many means of production are used in common, so that they contribute a smaller share of value to the product. New power emerges from the cooperation of many individual labor powers. A large tree trunk cannot be moved by an individual worker, regardless of how much time he is granted to accomplish the task, but 4 workers can move the trunk instantly. A further increase in productivity is achieved through division of labor. A complex labor process is broken down into a number of simple subfunctions. At the beginning of the 20th century, division of labor was carried to the extremes in Taylorism, named after the engineer who broke the movements of labor process down into the smallest elements in order to assign a portion of them to each individual worker. Time wasting and secret breaks would be minimized by this system, applied primarily in assembly line production. In the case of complex production concerned with a high level of quality, an overly strong division of labor proved to be rather obstructive, as it produced too much waste. The decisive heightening of the productivity of labor is achieved through the use of machinery. A machine is not merely a large tool in the hands of the individual but the tool of a mechanism. The number of tools that can be simultaneously operated by a machine is freed from human constraints. Individual machines are combined to form a system of machinery that the object of labor passes through. An enterprise based upon machine production is called a factory. In a mechanized factory, aside from not yet mechanized activities, the remaining task left to humans is that of monitoring the machines, repairing the machines, standing by, and eliminating mistakes. With the deployment of computer technology, a number of monitoring and control tasks are automated, but the controlling computer has to be monitored and its programming adapted to changing requirements. With machine production, capital can detach itself from the special skill of individual labor power. With the presence of a developed, well-functioning system of machine production, laborers are mere appendages of this system. According to Marx, the domination of capital over the workers materializes in the machine system. It is not the worker who employs the conditions of his work, but rather the conditions of work employ the worker. It is only with the coming of machinery that this inversion first acquires a technical and palpable reality. By means of its conversion into an automaton, the instrument of labor confronts the laborer, during the labor process, in the shape of capital, of dead labor, that dominates and pumps dry living labor power. Cooperation, division of labor and the use of machinery bring about a rise in the productive power of labor. With the same amount of labor expenditure, a larger number of products can be produced, so the value of individual product sinks. Meanwhile, individual labor power is reduced to a subfunction that is almost completely useless outside of manufacture and the factory. The fact that workers can do anything at all with their abilities seems to be a result brought about by capital. This appearance of capital as endowed with its own productive power can be referred to as the fetishism of capital. Just as the fetishism of commodities, it is not merely false consciousness or a simple misapprehension. Its foundation is the capitalist organization of the production process. The possibility of an intelligent direction of production expands in one direction, because it vanishes in many others. What is lost by specialized workers is concentrated in the capital which confronts them. Increasing productivity by means of machinery is different from its increasing by means of cooperation or division of labor in that it costs the capitalist something, and since the machine is used in the capitalist process of production, it transfers its value to the product. A cheapening of the product only occurs when the increase in value caused by the transfer of value from the machine is overcompensated through an accompanying reduction of immediate labor time. But for the capitalist use of machinery, it is not sufficient that the use of machinery generally cheapens the product. The capitalist introduces an increase in productivity so that his individual costs are lower than the social average, so that he not only obtains the normal surplus value but an extra profit. The capitalist will maximally expend the additional constant capital as much as he is able to save in variable capital per article. The variable capital saved does not solely depend upon the labor hours saved but also upon the level of wages. The same machine that at the low wage level brings no savings in cost for the capitalist is therefore not introduced. However, at a high level of wages, it reduces costs, and therefore is introduced. The cooperative labor process requires coordination. In the capitalist process of production, the capitalist assumes this coordinator function. It is also the organization of exploitation and is therefore conditioned by the antagonism between the exploiter and exploited, which leads Marx to the conclusion that capitalist direction and form is purely despotic. Capitalist despotism has experienced constraints through legal regulations on the one hand, and trade union bargaining procedures on the other. In recent times, in a number of industries there has been a tendency by capital to strengthen the autonomy of employees over the labor process. In the case of skilled trades, it frequently proved to be more advantageous to motivate employees to voluntarily bring in their experiences and performance capabilities through a higher autonomy rather than constant pressure and supervision. Throughout all these changes, the valorization of capital, the production of surplus value, was not called into question. Raising productivity means that the same amount of products can be made in a shorter period of time, but under capitalist conditions, a rise in productivity does not lead to shortening of labor time. Particularly with introduction of machinery, the result is lengthening of labor time as well as shift and night work in order to accomplish the longest possible run time for the machine. As long as the new machine has not yet become social standard, the capitalist who employs it in production realizes an extra surplus value. The more products, the greater this extra surplus value. The faster a machine transfers its value to the products it helps to produce, the lower the risk that it has to be replaced by a newer, better machine before it has transferred its total value. Modern industry never views or treats the existing form of the production process as the definite one. Its technical basis is therefore revolutionary, whereas all earlier modes of production were essentially conservative. Increasing profit is the sole motivating factor for this. Massive investments are made to acquire new machines or construct new production facilities. Insofar as this investment serves to reduce the cost of the product, they count as necessary. Capitalist production only develops the techniques and the degree of combination of the social process of production by simultaneously undermining the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker. This destructive potential of capitalist development of the forces of production can only be restrained from the outside, through the resistance of workers or the power of the state. Marx emphasized that a distinction must be made between the increased productivity which is due to the development of social process of production and that which is due to the capitalist exploitation by the capitalists of that development. Thus Marx was often accused of regarding the industrial production process itself positively and criticizing only its capitalist shell. This was also the position of Marxism-Leninism. Accordingly, in the Soviet Union capitalist methods of production were to some extent adopted completely uncritically. Today it is far clearer than in Marx's time that not every industrial process of production simply has to be detached from its capitalist application to suddenly develop its purely beneficial effects. The destructive potential of capital does not just assert itself in the way a technology is applied, but in the choice of particular technical industrial paths of development. In the case of an already existing labor process being subordinated to capital, Marx speaks of the formal subsumption of labor under capital. The laborer works longer than it is necessary for his own self-preservation, and the capitalist appropriates the surplus value thereby generated. In that case, only the production of absolute surplus value is possible. If the labor process is transformed in order to increase productivity, Marx speaks of the real subsumption of labor market under capital. The labor process is not only formally distinct but also in its entire organization and structure. The capitalist mode of production creates the material guise of production corresponding to its social form. The production of relative surplus value becomes possible. Let's assume an 8-hour workday and a rate of surplus value 100%. Then the workday breaks down into 4 hours of necessary labor time used to reproduce the value of labor power, and 4 hours of surplus labor time in which surplus value is produced. Now let's say the productivity of labor in all branches of the economy doubles. Then all goods can be produced in half the time previously required and their value is reduced by a half. The daily value of labor power is then already produced in 2 hours rather than 4. 2 additional hours remain for the production of surplus value. The value of labor power has been reduced by a half, but for that half just as many means of subsistence can now be purchased as previously for the whole amount, and the standard of living has remained constant. Now let's assume further that workers succeed in obtaining as wages not just the value created in 2 hours, but the value created in 3 hours. In this case, value of labor power would have still declined, the surplus labor would have still increased by an hour, but now the standard of living for the worker's family has increased. Increased exploitation and an increased standard of living for the working class are therefore not mutually exclusive. However, the majority of means of subsistence consumed in the working class household have to be capitalistically produced. After the Second World War, Fordism was established across the board. Consumer goods such as cars, refrigerators, washing machines, and televisions were constantly cheapened through Taylorism and assembly line production, but real wages increased. Since the value of labor power declined despite rising real wages, a rise in profit was still possible. Standardized mass production, mass consumption, and rising profit went hand in hand. Productive labor. Whether a specific type of labor expenditure is productive labor in the capitalist sense does not depend upon the concrete character of the labor, but upon concrete economic circumstances in which it occurs. If I bake a pizza in order to eat it myself or offer it to my friends, then I have created a use value, but not a commodity, and for that reason I have not produced any value or surplus value. But if I am hired as a cook in a capitalist restaurant, and if I bake a pizza that is eaten by paying guests, then I have not only produced value but also surplus value, and in this respect my labor was productive. Not only material products but services, insofar as they are sold, are commodities. Whether or not a particular article is quote-unquote really useful for the reproduction of society also does not play any role in determining its character as a commodity. In order to perform productive labor in a capitalist sense, I have to be a wage laborer. However, the opposite is not necessarily the case. If I switch from working as a cook in a restaurant to working in the household of the restaurant owner, I remain a wage laborer, but I no longer produce any commodities, only use values. The pizza that I prepare is not sold but consumed by the restaurant owner. The money he expends for his restaurant business is only advanced. If things go well for the restaurant business, the money returns to the owner, increased by the amount of surplus value. The money paid to me as a private cook is spent, the restaurant owner receives a use value in return but no money. I have produced neither value nor surplus value, and I am therefore quote-unquote unproductive. At the end of the valorization process, money is once again advanced as capital, and not as initial sum of value but a sum of value increased by the amount of surplus value, minus the consumption expenditures of the capitalist, that under otherwise stable conditions yields in turn an increasing surplus value. The transformation of surplus value into capital is called accumulation. Competition drives the individual capitalist to accumulate. He must participate in a race for a constant increase in productivity to keep up with the price competition. In case of large investments, when entire production facilities have to be renovated, there comes a point when the previously created surplus value is insufficient. The extent of accumulation can be enhanced by credit. There can also be cases in which the entire amount of surplus value is not required for accumulation, so that the rest of it can be invested as interest-bearing capital at banks or in financial markets. In both cases, the rate of interest is a decisive quantity. Insofar as the value composition of capital, or C through V, is determined by technological composition, Marx refers to it as the organic composition of capital, which accounts only for such changes of value composition that result from changes in technical conditions but not those that result from a change in value of the means of production used. If a coal becomes more expensive, then the constant capital C in a steel mill increases, and value composition of capital also increases without any change in conditions of production. So the value composition would have increased but not the organic composition. However, when addressing the average composition of total capital in a society, technical changes in one branch change the value of its products, which leads to a change of the value composition in all other branches that use this product. This means that changes in the organic composition can't be sharply distinguished from changes in value composition. If capital is accumulated under constant conditions, then the demand for labor power grows just as strongly as capital. If so much surplus value is transformed, under constant conditions, into capital that the sum of value advanced as capital rises by 20%, then 20% more labor power is also required. The rising demand for labor power initially improves the conditions under which labor power is sold. This diminishes surplus value, which slows further accumulation, puts a brake on demand for labor power, and therefore also any further rise in wages. If wages rise, then this also has consequences for the introduction of labor-saving machines, since in case of high wages, machines are introduced that would have brought no cost advantage at low level of wages. The typical accumulation process does not take place under constant conditions, but under an increasing value composition of capital. Even in the case of a continuous accumulation process, the demand for labor power and a rise in wages can be limited. The capitalist accumulation process itself ensures that wages on average are limited to the value of labor power and that this value, although historically variable, cannot climb so high that it seriously impairs the valorization of capital. The mass of workers who are willing or impelled to sell their labor power but who don't find any buyers are referred to by Marx as the Industrial Reserve Army. If we assume that the productivity of labor doubles, only half of the labor power is necessary for the production of a particular quantity of products. If so much surplus value is transformed into new capital that the production will double, then the number of employed laborers will remain the same. Marx assumed that capital tends to bring forth an increasingly growing industrial reserve army. At roughly constant number of forces of labor, this is only possible when the redundancy effect of the rise in productivity outbalances the employment effect of accumulation. Marx argues that there are two possibilities of growth for individual capitals. One occurs due to the transformation of surplus value into capital. Marx refers to it as the concentration of capital. Other occurs due to aggregation of different individual capitals, which he calls the centralization of capital. In case of centralization, the increased capital has more possibilities for investment at its disposal. It can acquire machines for which the means of the smaller capital was not sufficient, without a growth in total capital. Productivity increases with significant redundancy effects, as result of the centralization, without any opposing employment effect as the result of accumulation. Whether an employment or redundancy effect occurs in the whole economy depends upon the frequency of such centralization processes and the relation between redundancy effects resulting from them to the employment effects of remaining capitals. The tendency of growing industrial reserve army assumed by Marx cannot be strictly substantiated as a claim. However, it is clear that capitalism with full employment is always an exception. Full employment allows workers to impose higher wages, which leads to a slowdown in the accumulation process and/or the implementation of labor-saving machines, so that an industrial reserve army emerges once again. For the individual capitalist, the existence of this industrial reserve army offers a double advantage. The unemployed exert a downward pressure on the wages of the employed, and they really do constitute a reserve for volatile expansions of accumulation, a quick expansion, for example, on the basis of new sales potential in foreign countries. Appeals to business to do something to help reduce unemployment are always off base. In the 1920s, a theory of immiseration was understood as a theory of revolution. In capitalism, the masses are impoverished so that they inevitably realize that they have no other option than the revolutionary abolition of capitalism. However, the example of fascism, but not only this example, shows that most impoverished sectors of the population in no way automatically move to the left. During the so-called economic miracle in West Germany in the 60s and 70s, exponents of capitalism eagerly pointed out that Marx's immiseration theory had obviously been refuted by full employment and the constantly rising standard of living of workers, which was expanded to a fundamental argument against Marx's critique of political economy. Marxists then made a distinction, not explicitly present in Marx's work, between absolute immiseration and relative immiseration. There might be a rise in the standard of living, but the share that the working class has of the total wealth of society declines relative to that of the capitalists. Substantially, Marx advanced a theory of absolute immiseration in the Communist Manifesto, but in the first volume of Capital Marx emphasizes that it is precisely the production of relative surplus value that allows an increase in the standard of living of the working class concurrent with an increase in surplus value. What Marx criticizes is not a specific distribution of goods or income but the miserable working and living conditions, which he characterizes in terms such as endless drudgery and toil, ignorance, and brutalization. All means for the development of production undergo an inversion so that they become means of domination over, and exploitation of the producers. They distort the worker into a fragment of a man, they degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine, they destroy the actual content of his labor by turning it into torment, they transform his lifetime into working time. All methods for the production of surplus value are at the same time methods of accumulation, and every extension of accumulation becomes conversely a means for the development of those methods. It follows therefore, that in proportion as capital accumulates, the situation of the worker, be his payment high or low, must grow worse, constantly producing miserable living conditions in newer forms, even in the case of an increased standard of living. If one is actually interested in changing these miserable conditions, then one has no other option than the abolition of capitalism.